Today, video games are developed with production values comparable to blockbuster movies. However, in the early days of gaming, budgets were far more limited. When computers began transitioning from classrooms to homes, talented students and independent programmers started creating their own video games. In my opinion, this era marked the golden age of video games, a time when a vast world of possibilities awaited exploration and innovative game mechanics were still being invented. It is not my intention to recount the origins of the video game industry. Instead, I want to share a subjective and non-exhaustive list of some classic computer games I played during my youth, and perhaps you did too, that I believe laid the foundation for remarkable creativity in their time and remain just as playable and enjoyable today. So let's dust off that old classic computer. Let's take a nostalgic look back at where we started to truly appreciate how far we've come. Although the capabilities of personal computers in the 80s were quite limited, the imagination and ingenuity of those pioneering video game creators found ways to overcome such obstacles. It seems almost unthinkable that machines with CPUs running at just a few megahertz, and in some cases with less than 64 kilobytes of RAM, could serve as the cradle of open-world games and the birthplace of procedurally generated complex maps. And yet that was precisely the case, with spectacular games that must be appreciated within the context of the era in which they were created. We have all heard of Rogue, a game created in the early 80s for Unix terminals by university students, and the pioneer of the genre that relied on procedurally generated maps. In fact, it was this very game that gave its name to an entire genre, the roguelike. Yet Rogue worked with maps that were rather unsophisticated. They were built from just a handful of objects, characters, rules, and rooms. Not long after the appearance of Rogue, a game emerged that may not be as well known to today's gamers, but which took the concept of procedural universe generation and open-world design one step further. In 1984, David Braben and Ian Bell created Elite for the BBC micro-personal computer, a game that was later ported to many other platforms. This title was a marvel for its time, laying the groundwork for the exploration games that would follow. Without a doubt, it deserves recognition for having created its very own genre, the Elite-like. In Elite, the player could choose their own role within the game, acting as a commander, a pirate if desired, or a merchant seeking profit to upgrade and improve their ship. In Elite, you could travel from one planet to another without following a linear script, an entire galaxy contained within just 32 kilobytes of RAM. This game marked a true turning point in the world of personal computer video games, and not only because of its open world. It also redefined the very goal of playing, the score. Unlike earlier games, Hero Points had a purpose: upgrading your ship. The objective was no longer to finish levels with a limited number of lives. Instead, the game could be played indefinitely, until you ultimately rose to become an elite pilot. Of course, if we are talking about open worlds, we cannot leave Pirates off this list. Released in 1987, it offered, much like Elite, the freedom to choose your role within the game, to move about a vast open world, and to decide for yourself how the adventure would unfold. I played this game back then as well, but I suspect I was still too young to fully appreciate it. This game was an extraordinary achievement for its time. Free exploration with ports controlled by different 17th century powers, naval battles, sword duels, crew management and trade, treasure hunting, climbing the military ranks. A game that could easily be considered remarkably complete, even by today's standards. As personal computers became faster and memory grew, bigger games appeared, titles with richer open-world mechanics and greater freedom to explore. Hunter, released for the Atari ST and Commodore Amiga in the early 90s, allowed complete freedom to explore a vast map by land, sea, and air, with vehicles, weapons, and missions that could be completed in whatever way the player chose, by interacting directly with the environment. Hunter was one of the precursors of the 3D sandbox games of its era, much like another great title in my view, but highly underrated. Released in 1989 for the Amiga, Atari ST, and MS-DOS, Midwinter was also a game far ahead of its time. It offered a vast 3D open world covered in snow, where you could ski, drive snowmobiles, glide through the skies, and even take to the water. Part tactical strategy, part first-person shooter, part vehicle simulator. Midwinter blended genres in ways few had ever imagined. You could recruit allies, manage resources, and choose your own path to liberate the frozen island from invading forces. In many ways, it was a distant ancestor of modern open-world experiences like Far Cry or Just Cause. This game was continued with Flames of Freedom, with a more vast map of various isles, choice of player appearance, etc. It was a couple of true pioneers games, forgotten by many, but one that quietly shaped the future of gaming. Although these computers were still quite limited, they already offered expansive maps to explore, and some of these games provided surprisingly long playtimes given the available resources. However, these machines faced a significant limitation: storage media. Multi-loading from tapes often disrupted the sense of continuity, while the floppy disks of the era were slow and had very limited storage capacity. Affordable hard drives for the general public didn't become available until the mid-1990s. Yet this didn't prevent developers from creating long games. Head Over Heels remains one of my favorite games of all time. It consisted of a gigantic map of around 300 rooms, divided into 5 worlds, making it one of the largest game maps of its era. And all of this ran on a Spectrum with just 48 kilobytes of memory. It was a true programming marvel by its creator, John Rittman. It took me about 2 months to finish it for the first time, without cheats or guides, though to be fair, I've never been particularly good at playing games. For those of us who started out playing Mazogs, a game that was already capable of generating a new maze with enemies and weapons for every run, on a machine as simple as the Sinclair ZX81, all the way to today's titles, with maps stretching across millions of square kilometers like No Man's Sky, we've had the privilege of witnessing how these games have evolved, and what a wonderful journey it has been. Of course, there are many more beyond the ones I've mentioned here. Leave a comment with the game you loved, or the one that surprised you most with its map or its open-world mechanics that left a lasting impression on you. Although I was very young, I remember perfectly the first time I played this game on my Commodore 64. The carefully crafted and cinematic way in which the story was told completely drew me in and immersed me in the experience. From the very moment of the introduction, I realized this was not just another game. I was witnessing the beginning of a new form of art, the art of storytelling in video games. Today, it would be unthinkable for a quality game not to feature a carefully crafted narrative. Developers now have hundreds of tools and resources at their disposal that make the task relatively easy to implement. But in the mid-1980s, when Karateka appeared, it was something truly groundbreaking. To give the story greater realism, Jordan Mechner, the game's creator, used a technique called rotoscoping, a method previously employed in major animated film productions or games like Dragon's Lair. It involved recording live-action footage and then drawing over the projected frames as a template. Mechner filmed his karate instructor, and by using those recordings as the basis, he created the animations for the game's characters, achieving a level of realism never before seen. He would later return to this same technique in Prince of Persia, another landmark title that once again astonished players with its quality. But between the release of one and the other, a new narrative genre in video games made its debut, ushered in by a game that, I'm sure you'll agree with me, stands as one of the greatest and perhaps most loved games in history, Maniac Mansion. Although Sierra Online was the pioneer of the graphic adventure genre, or point and click as the genre was known later, it was without a doubt Lucasfilm Games that truly defined it thanks to this game. From its release onward, the graphic adventure genre continued to evolve and gain prominence year after year, bringing us more and better titles that kept us busy, trying out crazy object combinations for years to come. And the art of storytelling in video games continued to evolve. Games began to tell increasingly elaborate stories, adopting a more complex and cinematic language. One day, this particular game came into my hands, and with it, I felt the same sensation I had experienced many years earlier with Karateka. The story, the atmosphere, the way the plot unfolded, all of it gripped me from the very first moment. There was no score, no dialogue, no life counter. Everything was expressed through the characters' gestures, the music, and the setting. All of this achieved with just a handful of polygons, in such a way that it drew you in completely, leaving me utterly immersed in the experience. Eric Chahi, the game's sole creator, employed the same rotoscoping technique that Jordan Mechner had used years earlier in Karateka, although Chahi himself has said that his inspiration for this kind of animation came from Dragon's Lair. To me, Eric stands out as one of the most talented programmers ever to work in computer games. As an off-topic note, I recommend his virtual reality title, Paper Beast, in the style of his work. For a time, another storytelling genre became quite popular, text adventures, where the gameplay revolved around typed inputs or simple action verbs. These games cleverly overcame the limitations of early personal computers, since they only had to work with text and the occasional bitmap that changed as the story progressed, avoiding long disk loading times.
Well, a good adventure game would keep you busy for days on end, be warned. You'd probably need to draw a map of the locations, because the geography, not to mention the strategy, can get pretty mind-boggling. Unfortunately, though, there are also some really naff adventure games around. You'd have more fun doing your tax returns. So, before you buy, read the reviews, or better still, ask an addict.
I was never much of a fan of this genre of games, although one in particular did capture my attention. Borrowed Time. It was a birthday gift I received as a kid, so I played it, without much enthusiasm at first, but I must admit it eventually hooked me for a while. Since I was never especially drawn to this type of game, I can't say I've tried many of them. Leave me a comment with the titles in this genre that you think are truly worth playing. I'd be delighted to read your suggestions. Earlier, we mentioned some games that could certainly belong on this list, such as Elite or Pirates, but I'd like to focus more closely now on the titles that truly laid the groundwork for what we know today as role-playing games. Some people believe that the first RPGs began on consoles, with Zelda or Final Fantasy. But the truth is that this is one of the oldest video game genres, originating in the late 1970s, with very simple text-based adventures played on terminals. The history of this genre could easily fill an entire video of its own, so here I'll concentrate on a few of the games that struck me most, or that helped define the genre itself.
生まれた時のいきさつはね、何やったかな。やっぱりね、パソコンゲームのブラックオニキスとかウルティマみたいな影響を受けてるんですよね。
Ultima is quite possibly one of the longest-running video game sagas. The first installment appeared in 1981, and the last, one I hadn't even heard of until I began researching for this video, was released in 2013, Ultima Forever, Quest for the Avatar. There was even another game released in 2018 that, while it didn't receive permission to use the Ultima name, did feature the original protagonist and setting. Ultima was created by Richard Garriott, better known as Lord British, and it went on to become one of the most influential computer role-playing game series of all time. Starting on the Apple II, the franchise introduced players to vast open worlds, rich storytelling, and mechanics that helped shape the entire RPG genre. By the time of Ultima IV, Quest of the Avatar in 1985, the series had become a pioneer in introducing morality systems into games. Instead of simply defeating a villain, the player's true quest was to embody virtues such as honesty, compassion, and honor. This was revolutionary. It shifted the focus from merely winning to making meaningful choices that reflected the player's own values. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Ultima series continued to push the boundaries of what role-playing games could be. Persistent worlds, non-linear narratives, and complex interactions with non-playable characters. Its influence can be felt in countless modern titles, and I believe its legacy is still noticeable today. Games like Diablo, The Elder Scrolls, or Baldur's Gate might never have existed without Ultima. They offer a more modern experience, of course, but they share the same essence. Another of its most enduring contributions came in 1997 with the creation of Ultima Online, one of the first successful MMORPGs. It laid the foundation for virtual worlds that players could share, directly inspiring titles like World of Warcraft and shaping the entire landscape of online RPGs, though that is another story. Going back in time, after the release of the first Ultima games, as with all the earlier examples, other games emerged that refined the genre. In the case of role-playing games, perhaps the most notable was Dungeon Master. Released for the Atari ST in 1987 and later ported to the Commodore Amiga and MS-DOS with great success, Dungeon Master allowed players to experience a dungeon in real time, from a first-person perspective. Monsters moved and attacked simultaneously with you, creating a level of tension and immersion never before seen. Suddenly, the dungeon felt alive. The result was not only a revolutionary game, but also an enormously successful one. Dungeon Master went on to become the best-selling title in the history of the Atari ST. As my small personal addition to this genre's list, I'd like to mention another game that particularly caught my attention in my youth, and that I played on my Atari ST, Captive. Released in 1990, it was very similar to Dungeon Master, but it added a science fiction twist and procedurally generated maps. It was a very entertaining game in which you remotely controlled 4 robots from your briefcase, guiding them in their mission to free you from the prison where you had been unjustly locked away. Perhaps it wasn't the best game ever made for the old ST, but I believe it deserves to be remembered. It was also released for MS-DOS and the Commodore Amiga, which even received a sequel, though I must admit I never played it. I've only mentioned a few examples here, but the list could be much longer, and it would easily take an entire video just to talk about this genre alone. In those years, the golden age of personal computer video games, new mechanics and original, innovative ideas emerged that remain etched in our memories. I suppose that's why we feel such nostalgia for retro games and computers. In 1984, Tetris was born on a Soviet clone of the PDP-11 computer, programmed by Alexei Pajitnov. What started as a simple experiment quickly grew beyond the walls of Moscow's computer labs. Within just a few years, the game began spreading across the West, first on the IBM PC, then the ZX Spectrum, and finally on the Commodore 64. That version came with a striking soundtrack, very different from the now iconic melody that millions around the world instantly recognize today. Dune 2 came to the Commodore Amiga and MS-DOS, marking the beginning of real-time strategy games. Metal Gear was released for the MSX2 in 1987. I first encountered it on the Commodore 64, never imagining the immense success it would achieve years later. Metal Gear gave birth to the stealth genre. although at the time I didn't find it especially groundbreaking. Rambo 3 already had a certain level of stealth gameplay and appealed more to me. Of course, I didn't realize then that Metal Gear had come first and was in fact the true father of the genre. Lemmings introduced an entirely new puzzle genre that could be considered the ancestor of games like Pikmin. So many original titles in those years, each leaving a lasting mark that can still be felt in modern games. Which games left their mark on you in the 80s or 90s? Which titles do you think should be added to this list? Or which genre do you believe was best defined on the personal computers of the 80s? I look forward to reading your comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. Subscribe so you don't miss new content and to help support the channel. See you soon.